Hello, everyone. Welcome to Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. My name's Rob, and today we have Tim O'Neill. Tim is a blogger for History for Atheists podcast. Tim, why don't you give us a quick little intro about yourself, and then we'll get on the topic of is Halloween pagan?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm an atheist and a history writer, and I suppose my niche for history for atheists, my niche is I find that a lot of my fellow atheists get history wrong, and a lot of my fellow atheists use arguments against religion based on history, where the history is just completely wrong or oversimplified and therefore misleading. So for my sins, because I read way too much history, what I try and do is correct my fellow atheists on this. And some of my fellow atheists appreciate it, and some really don't. So I've got quite a few people who are not fans of mine, and I get a lot of hate mail, and I don't really care because I also get a lot of people who say thanks, and that's helped me out, and not just atheists, other people as well. But yeah, one of the topics that does come up with monotonous regularity, in fact, every year at around about this time of year, is the idea of the origins of Halloween and the idea that Halloween is pagan in origin. And I was just saying before we started recording, Rob, this is interestingly one of the things that atheists, many Christians, and many pagans agree on. But they all kind of agree on it for slightly different reasons. So for the atheists, it's Christians are stupid. Any Christians who celebrate Halloween are stupid, though they realize it's a pagan holiday. For the pagans, it's this was originally a pagan holiday, and we need to claim it back because it's our holiday. And for many Christians, it's we shouldn't celebrate this because it's a pagan holiday in origin and therefore originally satanic, and therefore it's wicked and evil and we shouldn't celebrate it. So they all agree that it's pagan in origin, and they're all wrong. It isn't. So, so let me go into the background on why.
Yeah, well, yeah, give us like just a quick history of Halloween in general, the name, the start, the progression, and any current trends. Like in America, we trick or treat or do jack-o'-lanterns. I don't know how you guys do it in Australia, but
Yeah,
start off with that, and then we'll get pretty deep pretty quick.
sure. Yeah, they've started to do the celebration of Halloween in Australia in the last sort of 10, 15 years. I think that's driven mainly by confectionery companies. It's never really been a traditional thing in Australia. That it's always been much bigger in America.
We will pause for a sponsor break from Handy Mike and Genesis Contracting. Handy Mike and Genesis are a locally owned and family operated handyman and contractor company serving the greater Charlottesville area since 2016. They are a Class A licensed, bonded, and insured contractor with over 60 years of knowledge. Their teams of skilled, reliable, and trustworthy technicians have been handpicked in order to provide our customers with outstanding service across a broad range of tradesman skills. Handy Mike can do all of your home maintenance repairs and small projects, from changing a light bulb to deck repairs to electrical and plumbing fixtures, and so much more. Genesis Contracting can handle larger jobs, including bathroom and kitchen renovations, remodels, and additions. If you're looking for a team to help make your dreams a reality and bring your concept to creation, call them today for a free estimate. 434 422 6000. You can also find more of their information in the show notes. Now, back to the show.
And
Do
it's
you
kind
think
of
do you think there's probably
it's
some
cool.
cultural exchange there too? Like, like it's featured in movies a lot
Oh,
and
absolutely.
just
Yeah,
just
yeah.
songs and just
Yeah.
general. I mean, the internet seems to be driven by American discourse largely.
It's very much that kids see Halloween celebrations on American movies and they want to do it as well. And that's, yeah, as I said, it's being driven by costume companies and trick or and confectionery companies. Halloween parties, like costume theme parties, have been pretty big for many years. But the trick or treating thing has really only sort of started in the last few years. But back to your question. So, what is Halloween originally? Halloween is an older English term for the evening before All Hallows Day. All Hallows. Hallows is an old English word meaning from Hallow, meaning holy. So the 1st of November in the Catholic tradition, so pre-Protestant tradition, was All Saints' Day. And in Old English, that was All Hallows. And so the day before, the night before, was known as Halloween. So All Hallows Eve. So that's why it's called Halloween. And nothing pagan there. It's All Saints' Day. So why All Saints' Day? The Christian tradition actually commemorated dead saints pretty early on. So from the 2nd century, we have references to people doing commemorations of martyrs in particular, so people who died for the Christian faith. That became even more common in the 3rd century with the great persecutions. So the persecution of Decius in the middle of the 3rd century, and then the persecution, the big one, of Diocletian at the end of the 4th century. So the whole cult of martyrs in the Catholic tradition became extremely big. And one of the things that we know from quite early on is that people were commemorating favorite martyrs, so people that they really honored who had died for their faith, every year as an annual ceremony. So that started quite early. That led to I suppose, a cult of the saints, which was this idea that there were some people who were so holy during their lives that they were regarded as saints after they died. And obviously, this is still very much a part of the Catholic and Orthodox and some other traditions, the Anglican, Episcopalian tradition, and so on. So this idea, the cult of the saints, became extremely powerful, extremely popular during the Middle Ages and well after. Each saint had their own saint day. Quite often, that was on the day that they died. So then it became a tradition in various parts of the Christian world of a day in which you commemorated all saints. But it was celebrated on different days in different parts of the Christian world. So the Orthodox Church celebrated on one day. The Catholic Church eventually celebrated on another. But as we'll find, that there were other churches that celebrated on different dates.
Yeah, the Christian tradition even celebrates Easter on different, like Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Protestant. I mean, and sometimes they all align right around Hanukkah, not Hanukkah,
Passover.
Passover. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Sometimes they all kind of align. Most of the time they don't.
Yeah.
Same with Christmas, right?
Same with
Orthodoxy
Christmas. Yeah.
celebrates it on January 6th.
Yeah, that's more to do with the change in the calendar than differing dates. It just worked out that way. But yeah, that's right. So why is November 1st All Saints' Day in the Catholic tradition? Well, the short answer is we don't really know. It seems to be possibly because of a dedication of a chapel in Rome to All Saints, possibly in we're thinking about the 7th century, and that seems to have been on that particular date. So it seems to be on November the 1st. What we do know, though, is that we start to see references to All Saints' Day being celebrated on November 1st fairly early on. So we've got one reference in a English, so Anglo-Saxon work called the Martyrologium Poeticum, or Poetic Calendar of Saints' Days, and this is marking the various feast days celebrated in York, so in this particular northern English city, and it makes a clear reference to a feast of All Saints on November 1st. So
what year was that?
The date of that is probably around about the late 7th century.
Okay.
So it says, a jewel worn on the brow sparkles time and again. So November, at its beginning, is resplendent with the praise given to all saints. And not long after that, we find Alcuin of York, who was a major scholar from the city of York, writing to a friend of his who was the Bishop of Salzburg, a guy called Arno, saying, on the calends of November, that's the 1st, is the solemnity of all the saints. So make sure, Venerable Father Arno, that you have marked the solemnity of all the saints, just as we said, keep it ever in mind and never cease to celebrate it on that annual date. So at this stage, Alcuin had moved from York to Aachen, which was the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. So he was brought there by Charlemagne as part of a campaign to increase education and learning within the Frankish Empire. So it's possible that this celebration of All Saints on 1st of November began in York and was brought to Francia, so brought to the Frankish Empire by Alcuin. Or it's possible that it began in Rome, came to the Frankish Empire, and then to York. And all that's happening here is Alcuin is saying, make sure you celebrate it on this day. The fact that he's saying, make sure you celebrate it on this day, though, indicates that there were possibly other days on which it could have been celebrated. But what we know is it came to be celebrated on the 1st of November across the Frankish Empire, pretty much from that point onward. So Pope Gregory IV promulgates it as the All Saints' Day on that date across the Frankish Empire. That was reinforced in 835 AD by Louis the Pious, that's Charlemagne's son, and that's recorded in a chronicle by Sigebert of Guillemot. So what we now know is that pretty much from the 9th century, it was standard across the Frankish Empire, that's most of Europe, across Italy, and it was already being practiced in Anglo-Saxon England. That what you just got there is effectively the history of All Hallows Day. Why Halloween? Several major festivals in the Catholic tradition get what's called a vigil, and really, really important ones get a vigil and an octave. So what that means is you don't just celebrate the feast day on the day, you start the celebration the night before, from sundown the night before, a bit like Passover. And so you then have a series of sort of pre-festival prayers and ceremonies that are held the night before. You then have the feast day itself with all of its ceremonies. And then if you have an octave, you have 8 days afterwards, right? So they were really big deals. All Saints' Day had a vigil and an octave until fairly recently. They don't celebrate it that way anymore. But the vigil was really important, and it was a very, very significant thing to have a feast day with a vigil. So what we're talking about with Halloween is the vigil, and then various traditions and prayers and so on which were associated with it, and then folk traditions that attached itself to those. Now, what you're not hearing in any of this is anything pagan. Okay, so where's the whole pagan connection thing come from? That comes from the fact that there was in the Celtic world, so Ireland's, Western Scotland's, parts of Wales, there was a tradition of a feast day on November the 1st as well, called Samhain. Right? So it looks like Samhain, but it's pronounced Samhain. And that seems to be a very, very old tradition in the Celtic world. So we actually have way back in the BCs, we have some references to something that seems a bit like Samhain in ancient Gaul, for example. So it seems that this was one of the quarter days, so one of the days that mark the 4 quarters of the year, and it seems that this was a fairly significant day. In fact, almost like New Year. So a lot of law cases that had to mark a year. We're going to agree to this for a year. They start the clock on November 1st. Oaths were taken on November 1st. If you promised that you were going to do a legal contract for say selling cattle, November 1st was the day. So it seems to be one of the equinoctial days where in the ancient Celtic calendar it was fairly important. What we don't have is any indication that it was a religious festival. There's nothing in any of our evidence. Now, a lot of our evidence for pre-Christian Celtic paganism is pretty patchy, but there's nothing to indicate that there were sacrifices on this day. There's nothing to indicate that there was any kind of like religious festival. There's actually nothing to connect it to the dead, and that's a big part of Halloween. It's all this commemoration of the dead. That's the whole point of All Saints' Day. It's commemorating
And
the
and
holy dead.
and even if it did, like equinoxes, new moons, like you even see that in Judaism. Um, I mean, it's just kind of it's a way, it's an ancient way to mark lineage, and
Yeah,
obviously it's gonna be it's gonna be used in special connection, maybe with the land or with God or with other pagan deities. It's very weird that I find it weird once you kind of realize that it's like, okay, Christianity has all these connections with paganism because it also like the Annunciation of Mary apparently happens on the spring equinox. That means it's pagan. Well, there's tons of stuff that happens in the Aztecs for the spring equinox. Same in Eastern China. Like, are those suddenly connected because they're all just recognizing a very neutral day mathematically in our solar calendar? Like, are they suddenly all connected? They're all connected because it's an easy time
yeah.
marker. And that's important in the ancient world. That's still important today. We still mark our seasons by that.
Yeah, and look, this is a point that many scholars have made. The Christian calendar is basically every day there's a saint day, a festival, a feast of some kind in the ancient Christian calendar. So of course they're going to coincide with some important pagan festivals. Doesn't mean that they're somehow connected, and
And
that's
those
pretty much
and those
sorry.
were yeah, and those were important because they didn't have weekends. Like they got
Yeah,
these were days off that they could get. So like they didn't have a marked every Saturday and Sunday, even in Christian liturgy. Like some they
yeah.
still worked a lot of the time. Yeah, that they went to church, but then they're going back and working their own field or something. But the feast days were actual, like, okay, no one's going to do anything. These are good
Yeah.
rest days.
And when they fell, usually had more to do with agriculture than anything. So of course the Christian festivals are going to fall on the same sort of days as the pagan ones, because those are the days when you don't have to work. So midwinter is kind of a quiet time in Northern Europe on the farm, because basically everything has gone dormant. The end of the festival, end of harvest is an obvious time to have a festival. Beginning of spring is an obvious time to have a festival. So of course there's that kind of coincidence, and this seems to be what's happened with Halloween and Samhain. It seems to be more coincidence than anything else. But just on Samhain as as a pagan festival, well, let's call it pre-Christian. I think would be more accurate. Um, as I said, no connection to the dead, no connection to religion, as far as we can see. Um, but it does seem to be a day in which people got together and had a good time. So there's the great Irish epic, the sickbed of Cuchulainn, so the legend of Cuchulainn, where he talks about it being a day with lots of feasting and sorry, the writer of that, lots of feasting and splendors and pomps, but there's no rituals. There's no sacrifices. There's no religious element to it. The only thing that we can kind of find that's even close is some legends associating Samhain with a connection to the other world. So in the Celtic tradition, there was this idea that there was the world that we lived in, and then there was the world of the Shay, the fairy folk, and the two sometimes connected. Sometimes they connected through particular places, and other times they connected at particular times of year. And one of the times of year in which they seemed to connect was Samhain. So there are some stories about fairy mounds opening, about connection, about encounters with the Shay, the fairy folk. Um, is this religious? No, not really. And is it anything like the later traditions of Halloween? No, not really. So there doesn't seem to be a hell of a lot of connection between Samhain and Halloween, other than the fact that it falls on the same date. Now, the interesting thing is, in the Irish church, for a long
Real,
time,
real,
for centuries.
real quick, Tim. We do definitively know All Saints Day or Halloween, All Hallows Eve, and Samhain. Those do typically fall, if not on the same day, like pretty close, right?
Oh, they fall on the same
Is
day.
that
They
They
fall on the
fall on the
same
same
day.
day. Okay,
So
good.
Samhain is November 1st. All Saints Day is November 1st. Halloween is the 31st of October. Same with they actually had a kind of a Samhain the night before Samhain. They had a kind of set of traditions regarding that as well, which mainly involved lighting large bonfires and sitting around a bonfire. There were traditions associated with the Samhain Eve, which were things like you'd light a bonfire, everyone would throw a stone into the bonfire. After the fire burnt down the next morning, you would try and find your stone. If you couldn't find your stone, it was a sign you were going to die that year, right? Now, this hung around long after the coming of Christianity, so that tradition was still practiced in Scotland and in Wales long afterwards. So it's not like there were some traditions associated with Samhain that didn't find their way into Halloween. They're just not the traditions we usually associate with Halloween. But that is one that did survive and is possibly still practiced in some places. But the interesting thing is, there was an All Saints Day in Ireland, but it wasn't on November the 1st for many, many centuries. So Ireland converted to Christianity way back in the 6th century, but it kind of did its own thing because it was off on the edge of the world. So it developed its own, what we call Celtic Christianity or Irish Christianity. It developed its own traditions, its own practices, its own prayers, its own structures, its own form of monasticism, its own form of way in which bishops functioned, which was totally different. And when I say different, I mean really different. Like bishops used to go to war, monasteries used to fight each other. It was Irish Christianity was really quite interesting, very Irish, yeah. And I can say that because I'm an O'Neill. The Yeah, but then what happened is the Anglo Normans, so basically the English, invaded and conquered Ireland in the 12th century, or conquered most of it. And what happened then was the Irish Church was brought more into line with the rest of the Catholic Church in Europe. And so, whereas before the Irish Church had celebrated an All Saints Day on April 20th and didn't do anything at all on Samhain, there was a couple of Saints Days that fell on that date, but that was about it. What then happened was the new bishops, who were all Anglo Normans, said no, you're celebrating on the wrong day, and they imposed All Saints Day on November 1st, and therefore Halloween on October 31st on the Irish. So it wasn't that Samhain was adopted as an All Saints Day and so it was originally pagan. It was actually the other way around. It was imposed from without on the Irish Church, who were basically told you've got to celebrate All Saints Day on this day, which just happened to already be Samhain.
And that's
So
the
the
only
origin of
time the Irish were ever imposed values on by the Brits.
yeah, beginning of a bad trend. So the whole idea that the origin of the date is this celebration of Samhain on November 1st is simply wrong. It actually gets it backwards. But whenever I try and tell people this, they always say, but there was this festival Samhain on November 1st, so you're wrong. And it's really difficult to try and explain to them why actually that is completely irrelevant. It was purely coincidental that a festival that was already being celebrated on November 1st then got imposed on Ireland and changed their All Saints Day from April 20th to November 1st. So that's the origin of the date, if that all makes sense.
Do we know why? Yeah. Do we know why the Irish picked April 20th? Is there a
No, it's
I'm
like
just
one of
kind
those
of
many things.
there?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But if you want to look at coincidences, if someone in the future noted that April 20th was also the birthday of Adolf Hitler and tried to make some connection between that and the fact that the ancient Irish Church celebrated All Saints Day, they would be completely barking up the wrong tree. That's just pure coincidence. April 20th is, by the way, the birthday of Hitler.
It is also a famous holiday for a certain type of intoxicant, um, at least in the States. Uh, and
That's
I
true.
and
I've
I
forgotten that.
and
Yeah.
I like to connect those two.
There
You
you
kind of
go.
beat me to that. It's like, oh, I told a friend it was like, yeah, I'm celebrating 420 today. I was like, are you a Nazi or a weed smoker? And he goes, I see the dots going on iPhone, and then they stop, and then they start again, and then they stop, and he goes, oh my gosh, you're right.
Yeah, there, doing the Googling. Well, that's a classic case of correlation does not equal causation. So, yes, there's a correlation between All Saints' Day and Samhain. No, that doesn't mean that Samhain was the point of origin for All Saints' Day. It was already being celebrated across Europe long before it ever got to Ireland or northern Scotland, Western Scotland, or Wales. So that's the origin of the date. Now, of course, you then get people saying, but look at all these traditions associated with Halloween. They're not Christian, so they must be pagan in origin. And what they're usually saying when they say they're not Christian, particularly, no offense to any Americans in this conversation, but particularly American Protestants, is by not Christian, they mean it's not in the Bible. But Christianity has a 2,000-year history and has developed a whole lot of traditions, many of which are not based on anything in the Bible. So All Saints' Day is obviously one of them. What happened was that All Saints' Day then
Giving
adopted a
giving presents on Christmas.
exactly,
Famously,
yeah,
Christ's birth is in the Bible, not the date.
yep, yep,
Giving giving marshmallow bunnies, at least in America, on Easter.
yep.
Famously, not marshmallows. I don't know when marshmallows were invented. Pretty sure they weren't invented in the first century.
Very unlikely due to the distinct lack of sugar. So yeah, I think yeah. So we can say that a tradition can be Christian, but not necessarily based on the Bible. In fact, many of them are. What happened with All Saints' Day is it was followed by All Souls' Day. So November 1st is All Saints' Day. That's where we celebrate. Well, they celebrated all of the saints. All Souls' Day was where you celebrated everyone else. In the Catholic tradition, when you die, you don't necessarily go to heaven. Saints, obviously, we're celebrating the ones who did. But on All Souls Day, what they were doing was they were thinking about their relatives who had died, who they were hoping had gone to heaven, but might be stuck in purgatory. So in the Catholic tradition, purgatory was this halfway house. You might not get to heaven straight away, but you had to work off your sins in purgatory. You didn't go to hell because that's a one-way trip. But you work your sins off and eventually you get to heaven. Kind of gets around some of the problems with the whole condemning people to eternal damnation thing. Of course, let's say it's dubious on a couple of fronts. But anyway, widely believed. So what was going on was people were thinking about all of the saints on All Saints' Day. They were thinking about the various souls of their dear departed on All Souls' Day, which meant in the lead up to those two festivals, they were doing a hell of a lot of thinking about them potentially dying and maybe going to heaven or maybe not. So one of the things that was encouraged was for them to do acts of charity, because again, in the Catholic tradition, you can accrue points towards heaven by doing good things on earth. So one of the things that happened was people used to give money to the poor, they used to give food to the poor, and that evolved into a tradition of soul cakes. So these were easy to distribute food charity. There were cakes that were baked with usually with dried fruit in them, and they were given to the poor. And the poor would come to the door of rich people and to receive maybe some money, maybe some food, but definitely some soul cakes. It's not
And
might
and
not
and
say,
these soul cakes, is this throughout Europe or is this in
yep.
England specifically? And where do these kind of soul cakes originate?
Okay, we've got plenty of evidence of it for Britain. So across Britain, both England and also the Celtic areas of Britain. And there are versions of this in other parts of Europe. It's not always cakes. It's usually something, it's usually something along those lines. The whole idea, though, is that it's something that you can distribute pretty easily to people who come to your door. And make them go away fairly quickly. So this became the tradition that poor people would expect that if they went to a richer person's door, that they would get something in return. This is the origin of trick or treating. And then it turned into a bit of a game. So what you would then do is you would do what was called geezing or mumming. Geezing is connected to our word for disguise. And when you went geezing or mumming, what you did was you put on a mask or you just blacked your face, and you maybe put something over your head, and you pretended that you weren't you. There were various times of the year in which geezing or mumming was considered a fun thing to do. Christmas time was one of them. So mumming was quite common at Christmas time, but All Saints, All Hallows Eve was one of the main ones. So what you would be doing
And
is you would
when
be
is this geezing and mumming? When does this kind of come into the cultural zeitgeist?
this is in the Middle Ages.
Okay.
This is by we've got references to it by about the 12th, 13th century. We've got plenty of references afterwards. So it was very common right up into the modern era. And I suppose the game or the fun of it is you're pretending that your neighbours won't know who you are. So it's not like you're disguising yourself to the point where they genuinely wouldn't know. They would know that this was Rob wearing a silly mask, come to my house to pretend that he's a poor person who I need to give these cakes to.
It's kind of a fun little neighborhood drama.
Exactly. And if you live in a village where everyone knows everyone, then it's a game. And then, of course, after they've left, you would then put your mumming disguise on. You go to their house and do the same thing. So it was basically a bit of a laugh. Part of the fun was that people would sometimes come into the house, and you would pretend that you didn't know who they were. So you'd ask them questions, and they'd have to answer. And quite often, you would ask them questions about the person you knew they were, and you'd ask some embarrassing questions, and they'd have to try and give an answer. So it was all a bit of a laugh. But this is the origin of the trick or treating, the disguising part. And if you look at very very early depictions of Halloween costumes, they're really not really very much. They're not really costumes. They're usually just people with their faces blacked. The people with a mask, fairly primitive mask on. The whole idea of dressing up as a ghost or a devil or a witch or whatever, that's very very new. That's very very extremely recent. So this is the origin of trick or treating. There is no evidence at all of any pre-Christian version of this on Samhain or any association around about that day. So the idea that this was a pagan practice, you see many sort of Christian claims, the old Jack T. Chick tracts. I don't know if you've ever seen those, but they claim that the Druids used to come around and try and take away children for human sacrifices. So if you had to give them a way of placating them, so you give them some food or something instead, and that's the origin of trick or treating. That's completely made up. There's no evidence of
The,
anything like trick or treating in the pagan evidence that we have.
the Druids and the Vikings seem to magically be a blank slate for a lot of things.
Oh yeah,
Apparently the Vikings were the first LGBT pro culture, and I learned that from Twitter. It was amazing. I'm sure they were very accepting of trans people in the 1100s.
I think what's going on there, just without getting too sidetracked from Halloween, but what's going on there is that there certainly were some traditions in the Viking culture where men dressed as women, but it was nothing like trans. It was, in fact, it was mainly associated with magic, and it was basically saying it was kind of like turning the world upside down. So it was basically saying things are all backwards, and they wouldn't dress as women all the time. They'd only dress as women in particular circumstances. So yeah, you have to be really careful with mapping modern phenomena onto the past by taking things that look a bit similar. It's parallel, not correlation again. So that's the origin of the trick or treating thing. It's got nothing to do with anything pagan. It's basically started out as let's give money and food to poor people, and then it turned into a game. The other one that I often get is jack-o'-lanterns. So jack-o'-lanterns apparently are supposed to have been something pagan and have a pagan origin. Again, the story is that something about something to do with a beheading of people as part of human sacrifice.
Yeah, I was going to
Uh,
ask if there's any Sleepy Hollow
yeah, the
Victorian
Druids,
era kind of
the Druids
mingle
come
in
into it.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Druids go into it again. So the Druids apparently were coming around and taking people away. And so if you put a pumpkin in your window, it made them go away or something. I don't know. Total nonsense. To begin with, pumpkins come from North America, so no pumpkins were involved. What we do know though is that people,
One of my favorite. Anytime I hear people talk about Saint Patrick. So like Saint Patrick famously, or culturally at least, Christianized Ireland, and he was taken as a slave actually from Britain to Ireland and a lot of people will be like, yeah, he farmed potatoes. I'm kind of like, if St. Patrick was real, which he probably was, he was not farming potatoes in Ireland yet because potatoes are from Peru. Like they're not in Ireland for like another millennia minimum.
Literally 1,000 years before potatoes came anywhere near Ireland. So yeah, well, it's the same with pumpkins. There was a tradition involving making lanterns out of turnips, and these were sometimes called these were called punkies or sometimes called spunkies. And the idea was you carried them when you went trick or treating, and you carve little faces in them, bit like the pumpkins today, which look kind of scary. The idea was that what you're making is a lantern out of something that's disposable, and in the centuries before plastics, it had to be something organic, and it had to be something that wasn't worth anything. It had to be something that was easy to carve, which narrows things down to basically turnips. So they used to put little candles in turnips and carry those around and have these little scary faces on them. That's the origin of jack-o'-lanterns. This tradition, the trick or treating tradition, and the geezing tradition all found their way from places like Scotland and Ireland, and to a lesser extent Wales, to the United States. And for whatever reason, they took root there more than in most other places that the Irish and Scots migrated to.
Yeah,
So
I want to make sure a lot of these traditions we're talking about um are the British Isle
yeah,
centric, right? Like, yes, we've talked about the Catholic Church a little bit and some of the rest of Europe, but most of this seems to be culturally coming from the British Isles. Is that correct?
certainly those traditions, the traditions of dressing up and associations with the dead, do seem to have been, and I haven't done a whole lot of research on this, but do seem to have developed in other parts of Catholic Europe. But they're all Catholic in origin. They're not they're all based on this whole Day of the Dead, All Saints, All Souls days. But the trick or treat.
That's good enough there for a fundamental American Southern Baptist to not associate with them. So
So
just
it's
tell them it's Catholic in origin, and they'll run real far.
Well, I'll come back to that because that actually helps us to understand how this whole pagan origin thing began. But let's talk about what happened. It got to America. It became bigger in America, but even in America, it wasn't huge until the late 19th century. And then for various reasons, it got bigger. And then basically it became associated with the trick-or-treating thing became associated with the mass production of confectionery, so candy and chocolate. And then it got commercialized, and then it got massive and in America. So then it became, by about the 1940s, 1950s, this whole trick or treating thing became huge, but it hadn't actually been massive before that. And then, as I was saying before, it's now spread through American cultural influence to other parts of the world. So now I see kids dressed as ghosts wandering around trick or treating here in Sydney. 10 years ago, I would never have seen that, and that's purely through American cultural influence. This is despite the fact,
And I assume you said you might have attended like some like Halloween kind of
yeah, you'd have Halloween
like
costume parties,
house parties or
yeah,
something growing up, but
but
not
that was a
nothing to the scale that you might see in say like any movie that's released around Halloween, vaguely
no,
Halloween oriented.
but that wasn't as kids. That was as teenagers, and into our 20s, and that was probably again more due to American cultural influence because we watch high school teen movies from the US where they have Halloween parties, and we think that looks fun, so we did it. So it's not actually a major tradition. This is despite the fact that Australia has a huge Irish ethnic population. I'm one of them. So,
Yeah,
but for some
when I was in
reason,
Australia, I was surprised about like that you guys just had those waves of immigration, Irish, Italian, Greek.
yeah,
You guys just seem to just every 20 years you had a new like anyone from this country can come here for free, just come here please, and then tamp it down.
Yeah, well, with the Irish, the first wave was largely involuntary. My first ancestors were convicts who were brought here by the British to work in chains. But then there was the potato famine, and then yeah, you're right. We've got various waves after that. So where did the whole idea that, given that it didn't have a pagan origin, and trick or treating isn't pagan in origin, and jack o' lanterns aren't pagan in origin, where did this idea come from? It actually came from the Puritans, who decided that anything that was not biblical was therefore popish, a Catholic, and popish meant pagan, and pagan meant satanic. So, in order to discourage people from doing anything that wasn't sort of biblically based, things like Halloween, Christmas, a lot of the Easter ceremonies and traditions, they basically said that's not biblically based. That's therefore that's Catholic. Catholic, that was originally all pagan. Pagan, that originally comes from Satan. And that's basically the idea behind all of these. Christmas is pagan in origin, Easter is pagan in origin, Halloween is pagan in origin, Valentine's Day is pagan in origin. This pop history that we've got about all of these festivals, and in every single one of those cases, it's not true.
Can't
All of
keep
these
a good
things.
fundamentalist Protestant down. I'll tell you what.
This is an idea that simply will not die. But it began in the 16th century. It got really strong in the 18th century. But then what happened is it influenced the beginnings of folklore studies. So the earliest studies into folk traditions really began in the 18th century by people that we now refer to as antiquarians. These were largely gentlemen hobbyists, and they weren't really terribly good at research. They were good at kind of gathering a whole lot of stuff together, but they would come up with some wild and woolly theories as to the origins of stuff. So I was listening to a podcast yesterday. They were talking about the ancient British warlord or war lady Boudica, Boadicea, and an antiquarian decided that she was buried under Stonehenge. That's what Stonehenge was. It was Boadicea's tomb. He just made that up. They were very good at just making stuff up. The first reference we have to Samhain being an ancient pagan festival comes from a guy called Geoffrey Keating, who was an Irish antiquarian. He was a gentleman hobbyist scholar, and he just kind of made that up. And he made up a whole lot of other stuff as well. But what then happened was in the 19th and even into the early 20th century, this idea of pagan origins of ancient customs and festivals was so deeply ingrained into the study of folklore that no one questioned it. So it just became, well, that must be true. So let's go and find what the pagan origin of this must be. This is an old tradition. This is an ancient festival. It must have a pagan origin. Let's go and find it. It wasn't until really the second half of the 20th century that historians began to say, well, hang on a minute, is this true? And this is why modern historians have gone and revisited this and found that in most cases it just isn't. Certainly in Halloween, it isn't. It is Christian in origin, just pre-Protestant Christian. It's Catholic in origin. Now, as you said, that might be enough for certain people in the United States to dismiss it on that basis alone, but that's their business. All I'd say is if people are claiming it's pagan in origin, that just doesn't square with the evidence.
Where do you think the like do you think people obviously there's an anti-Christian, anti-religion bent to some atheists, but this also just seems to be kind of permeated throughout the culture. You'll see, I mean, you'll see magazine covers, even sometimes prominent magazine covers. Picture this. Obviously, that in these days, it's just a headline to sell something. But there does seem to be some people who honestly catch this and believe it. When in your armchair, how would you psychoanalyze just the kind of permeance of this? The it won't die. Like what you just said. Why do you think it captures people's attention?
Well, there's two things going on. One thing is as I said, up until the early 20th century, the pagan origins of Halloween thing was pretty well accepted because no one had actually bothered to go and have a look and see how well evidenced it was. So you would find it in encyclopedias, and as a result, you still find it in a whole lot of online articles. But if you pay attention to those articles, what they do is they just state it and they don't actually back it with any evidence. So it's just become one of these things that has been repeated and repeated and repeated. And people who have researched articles on that have basically researched it by going and looking at some generalist books on this. You really have to dig down into specialist literature by historians specializing in folklore to get to the analysis that shows that it's completely wrong. So it's one of those things that just gets repeated. Why do people resist it? Well, one is a lot of people have good reason to do so emotionally. So fundamentalist Christians don't like the idea of something that's not biblically based. It's kind of, it looks a bit like it looks a bit kind of satanic because you got witches and ghosts and stuff. So it looks a bit occult. So they've got and they've been told by their pastors and preachers that it's pagan in origin. So they've got a psychological reason to accept that and to resist anyone telling them it's
To
otherwise.
uh to put my cards on the table, I my first trick or treating I remember was actually in my church's sanctuary. They would like so I'm on the other end there. They're just kind of like, dude, this is for a bunch of six
it's
year
it's
olds
it's not a
dressing up and
problem.
having a good time and getting high on candy.
Yeah,
Whatever.
yeah, it's not a problem. I think the other reason that a lot of people resist it, and I find this when I'm debunking a lot of bad history, is it's something that people quite often read or get taught when they're quite young. And it is very threatening to them if someone, a spoil like me comes along and says, yeah, I'm sorry, actually, but no. And so they really don't like that because that means that Mrs. Jenkins, who taught them this in the fourth grade, or, this amazing fact that they read in the library when they were, 10 years old, is wrong. And so that feels like a bit of a personal attack. And people really don't like being told, people don't like being told they're wrong. I know that because I'm telling people they're wrong every day, and I can assure you that I don't like it at all. But personally, I think I like learning that I'm wrong. I think it's a good thing because it means you're learning something new. It means you understood the world in an imperfect way before, and you're now understanding it a little bit more. But maybe I'm weird. I don't know.
I think you're weird, and you're weird like me because I also love like, oh, that's so cool. I was wrong. Now I
Yeah,
might correct
yeah.
it.
Now I know
Uh,
something better. Yeah.
my personal opinion on that is I also think there might be some for lack of a better term some like Gnostic psychology going on there. Like I know the secret
Oh
truth
yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and I have to spread and now I have to evangelize the secret truth, which is so weird because the the broad term Gnostic is kind of mystical and secret religion, but also not. And it's a lot of people also don't really know the great umbrella term of that anyway. But the kind of just like, oh, I've got this secret knowledge and I know the real truth. So
Yeah.
I also think there's kind of like a pumping up sense of self
There
thing going on
certainly
there.
is. A few years ago, I came across someone on Facebook, a friend of a friend, who was basically saying, "Well, pretty much that. I've got this insight on Halloween. It's amazing. This amazing revelation that it's all pagan in origin." First of all, that's not really an amazing revelation. It's a pretty commonly unknown thing. I then stupidly tried to correct her and said, very gently said, no, that's not true. And got a whole lot of her friends attack me and telling me that I didn't know what I was talking about. Because she was an academic. She was actually a medievalist. And I had to say, well, that's nice. So am I. And she's still wrong. Right? And here's evidence. But they didn't want to know. They decided that she was right and I was just a poopy head. I
Yeah, I
get
think
that.
I mean that I kind of understand if she's an academic, and I mean I understand, but also as an academic, maybe you should be able to swallow that pill. But
Yeah, yeah. Particularly when I gave her references and said, go and read Ronald Hutton's article in Folklore and from 2 years ago and tell me where it's wrong. And she couldn't. She just tried to pull rank on me. So yeah, that's why I don't bother arguing with people on Facebook.
so besides some of the claims we've gone through, give us give us some other examples of like more ridiculous claims, perhaps, or some of your some of the fun remembrances on of the Twitterati who
Yeah.
or maybe here's a better question. What are some newer claims I know you kind of cycle through this almost every year. What are some newer claims you've seen
On
about
Halloween
Halloween?
specifically, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the neo-pagans, so the people who kind of practice a modern form of paganism, they love making up all kinds of stuff. And Halloween was apparently there was a wholesale massacre of pagans, and this is why it's associated with the dead, and which this is just pure fantasy. So you get a lot of that kind of stuff. You certainly get a whole lot of projection back of those modern traditions into the distant past. So you get these pictures of Gothic looking so-called ancient pagans dancing around with pumpkins and so on. Well, as we pointed out, there's a horticultural problem with that with that image. No one in ancient Ireland was dancing around with a pumpkin.
There's a passage from the King James where I think they mistranslated in Mark or maybe Matthew, where Jesus is walking through a cornfield,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
and
That's
it's like, that's not correct.
well, corn in the English and certainly in the older English term simply means any kind of seed or grain.
Okay,
And so corn was actually used to refer to wheat, barley, or even oats.
there you
So
go. Learn
walking
something
through a
new.
cornfield really would have originally have meant something like walking through a field of grain. So the word acorn,
Okay.
for example, acorn means oak seed. AC was the Old English word for oak, ak, and oak corn, oak seed, acorn. So there you
There you go.
go.
Learn something new. Maybe I had been using that example for a while. I will not use that example anymore.
That's it's not a mistranslation, but you've possibly misunderstood the meaning of the word corn there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Um,
again, that's me using a current word and projecting it back, right?
exactly.
And
Yeah, exactly. Another example. Another one I mentioned, the non-British traditions, and I must admit I haven't done as much reading on those, but the Mexican Day of the Dead is sometimes said to be a Christianization of an ancient, a pagan Central or North American festival of some kind of Aztec or Mexica festival. I can't find any evidence of that at all. So the Day of the Dead does seem to be simply All Souls Day. So it seems to be again just Catholic. Now, is there anything in the Mexican
but
celebration
yeah, that's
that
what I was going to
that
ask. Because Day of the
maybe
Dead is definitely like I don't know anywhere else. It's largely celebrated outside of Mexico,
yeah.
and
So
as at least in its traditional, or what I
yeah,
would view it as traditional form.
I think Guatemala, I think some other Central American places, some Central American places have, but yeah, it's mainly big in Mexico. It's mainly big in Mexico because Mexico has been Catholic for like the last half millennium. And but if you look at
Whether
some
it
of the
wanted to be or whether it wanted to be or not, it is.
that's right, but it certainly became so. And if you look at like some of the decorations and so on, there's a huge emphasis on skeletons, huge emphasis on skulls. Now, is that something that just sort of arose on its own because of the association with the dead? That's very likely. Or is it somehow connected to pre-Christian ideas about death and the dead? Because we have Aztec and other Mexica, early pre-Christian depictions on temples and so on with lots of skulls. Don't know. So there could be a pre-Christian element to it, but the origin of the
Yeah,
date.
I did a pretty big dive into conquistadors and the pretty brutal repression of Native Americans in that area by the Spanish, and it was pretty. They were pretty consistent in the fact that they were going to stamp out any and all pre-Christian culture from language to traditions, and I find it pretty hard that something like that would survive in its cultural legacy for that long without the Catholics doing pretty brutal
Agree.
repression of it.
Agree, yeah, and this is the thing. Again, it's a little bit like, well, here's something that's unique to Mexico, so it must be pre-Christian. It must be Aztec or Mexica in origin. It's a little bit like the argument in Europe. Yeah, just because there's an old folk tradition doesn't mean it goes all the way back to pre-Christian times, and even if it does, like the bonfire tradition on Halloween doesn't make it actually religious in any
Isn't
ways.
it? Did I read it by you or maybe someone else that like the bonfire on Halloween might also be connected to like Guy Fawkes Day? Is that like
I no, I think you didn't get that from me.
okay?
Um, but Guy Fawkes Day is a different date to begin with. Guy Fawkes Day is purely because of the day that Guy Fawkes was tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament, and the bonfire is basically a celebration of the fact that Guy Fawkes failed. I think people just like lighting big fires and standing around them if you're going to have a
Can
festival at night in
can
winter.
attest. I like doing it just to have some guys over and have some beer. And
That's right.
nothing
So
like looking at burning coals while you're
yeah,
drinking some
stand around
suds with your
having.
buds.
That's exactly right, and particularly if you're going to be doing it in Northern Europe in autumn or winter, you kind of want to have a fire if you're going to have a festival outside. So, but they also have bonfires on Midsummer's Day, on St. John's Day. So I think it's just the thing that humans like to do. We love lighting big fires and standing around them. You're right.
Tim, thanks for coming on. And is there any other any others? Are you going to any Halloween celebrations you think this year?
Actually, it's a bit
Are you gonna
early.
hand Are you gonna hand out some? Are you gonna hand out some candy? Well, it's early now on recording, but I'm gonna try to release it a few
Yeah.
days before. So
Well, as we mentioned before we started, I was in the US on holiday, on vacation this time last year, and I think it was around about this time I was in Montana, and they were already. It was early October, and there was Halloween decorations everywhere. Whereas in
people love
Australia,
it. People love
yeah,
it.
they do. It's huge.
I've got pumpkins out on my porch already.
Yeah. Whereas in Australia, if you see anyone decorate their house at all, it might be like a couple of days before Halloween. It's not like the whole month. But everything's backwards here anyway. Like we're in the middle of we're coming into spring.
Yeah.
It's not fall or autumn. It's not quite the same. So, but yeah, no, I'm not. Actually have no plans for Halloween. But as I said, it's not really a big thing here. So occasionally someone will invite you to a costume party on Halloween. That hasn't happened for me for a few years. So we'll see. Tomorrow I will be on
You must be so much fun at a Halloween cocktail party.
going up to people and saying, well, actually, it's not pagan in origin. No,
Yeah,
I try
yeah,
not
yeah.
to. No, I try not to. I've got some social skills, Rob. So
Okay, okay.
it's only if someone asks me, and then I'll bore them to death.
Politely engage them. Cool.
Yeah,
Well, thank you for coming on. I will put your blog and others and your YouTube channel in the show notes. You guys should follow Tim on Twitter, especially if you're looking for fun, spicy content and just some learning in general. I've learned a lot from Tim, so thank you so much for coming on. And
no problem. There's a detailed article where basically I lay out all of this stuff and a lot more with all the quotes and all the scholarly references, just in case you think I'm making all this up. And
yeah,
I've
yeah,
also
I'm gonna link that directly.
into that. And there's a YouTube video that I did whereas if you want to just sort of watch me sitting and talking about it in my lounge room, and a podcast version if you want to listen to it while you're going for a walk. So
I'll drop all those. Thank you so much,
good on you,
Tim.
Rob. No worries, mate. See ya.
Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.